Welcome to the Abnormal Psychology lecture for week 2. This week we're going to be talking about paradigms in psychopathology. When we're talking about paradigms, what we're meaning is how do we understand abnormal psychology? How do we understand these psychological disorders? In thinking about this lecture, we really have two main goals. We want to start critically thinking about the what and why of psychopathology. What are psychological disorders? What do we mean by that? And why do psychological disorders develop in individuals? We notice in our society that even if individuals have the exact same background and exact same experiences, one individual may develop a psychological disorder and another may not. Well, why? So today we're going to be talking about some of the theories behind the why. Finally, we'll finish and talk a little bit about treatments for psychological disorders. With each of these questions, the what, the why, and the how do we treat, we're going to be talking generally in this lecture about psychopathology broadly. As we continue on with the course and we talk about individual disorders, mood disorders, anxiety disorders, trauma and related disorders, then we'll really get into the details for those disorders, the what, why, and how. But today, more broad. Let's start with the what. I'd like you to take a minute, and you may have read the chapter corresponding to this lecture already, or may not have, but I want you to just take a minute and think, how would you define psychopathology? Or maybe you're less familiar with that word and think, how would you define abnormal psychology? What are we talking about? What counts as psychopathology? What counts as a psychological disorder? As you're thinking about it, there are various different definitions out there, and most of those definitions converge on 4 essential elements to what counts as a psychological disorder. And maybe you got some of these elements in the definition that you came up with. The first element that I'd like to focus on is personal distress. When an individual experiences a psychological disorder, psychopathology, then there needs to be some level of distress or discomfort associated with it. The behaviors, the thoughts, the emotions that individual experiencing has to cause distress. And it's not just normal distress. We all experience stress in our daily life. When we have an exam coming up, that's stressful. When we lose a loved one, that also is distressing. But this goes beyond the normal distress, and it's distress that somehow is problematic for us. Now, this criteria alone cannot perfectly tell us when psychopathology is present. Because for many disorders, especially as we get to some of the personality disorders later on, there's limited insight that individuals have into the disorder. And for them as individuals, they may not cause personal distress. They may affect people all around them. They may cause distress for family members, friends, employers, but there are some disorders that don't cause personal distress. So again, personal distress alone, it's a good criteria, but it's not sufficient or not necessary always for there to be a psychological disorder present. So what can we add to that? Well, the next we might think about disability. Whether or not the person is feeling distress, for it to be a psychological disorder, maybe we'd expect that there is some disability present. it has to be impairing at some level. And that might be at school, at work, in relationships. There has to be some limitations to the individual because of the disorder. As we think about disability, though, the question that comes to mind is are we talking about a true disorder within the individual, or a difficulty just within our environment? Perhaps what might cause someone to be impaired in one culture or in one situation might in fact be a strength or an asset in another culture or another situation. So we see that there's some limits to just personal distress alone, and also we should consider that disability alone would have some limits if we were to only classify a psychological disorder based on that. So perhaps next we can think about violation of social norms. With violations of social norms, we're talking about a behavior, thought, or emotion. It has to be abnormal or deviant from others. So it's not a common behavior that you see in society. It's not a common thing. It deviates in some way, and particularly in some negative way, as defined by society. But again, here we get to the individual society. Some societies may fully accept and fully kind of embrace. The majority of the society adapts certain behaviors, and in other societies it's completely different. When we're talking about psychological disorders, we don't want to just have a disorder that's societal based alone. So again, limitations with only considering violations of social norms. The last one is dysfunction. When we consider something to be a psychological disorder, there has to be some type of not just impairment in how they're living in their life, but impairment in the mechanisms underlying the thoughts, the behaviors, the emotions. Something has to have gone wrong. Let me share a couple examples for each of these based on clients that I've worked with in the past at various stages of my career. In thinking about personal distress, I worked with a client once who was a student. She was a graduate student at another university and very successful, had gotten straight A's throughout her entire life. And she was in graduate school now and had proposed her dissertation. And that's a monumental task, a major kind of achievement to get that far and to actually propose it. During her proposal meeting, her committee of faculty members had recognized a few flaws in the project that she had wanted to do. And it was very minor kind of criticisms or feedback that they had given her. But they asked her to make some changes and come back and report to them again. Now for her, she had based her whole identity on being a perfect student, on being the top of her class, on getting 100% in everything. And so when she got this feedback, it broke her down. It led to a level of distress for her that she couldn't cope with it any longer. She felt like she was a complete failure, and that personal distress was very painful for her. Now for her, that personal distress led to daily crying episodes that lasted hours. It led to a physical pain for her. And it led to our next one, the disability. It led to the impairment. So because the distress was so strong, she no longer could work on making those minor changes that she needed to make. And she was at risk of being kicked out of her doctoral program, even though the changes were very, very minor. even though she was fully capable of making those changes. And this is what we're talking about disability. The disorder stopped her from performing how she can usually perform, from performing the way that would be expected from someone else in her situation. Let me give you another example of disability. I worked with a client who, in another state, who had obsessive compulsive disorder. And this client was worried about germs. And she was worried that somehow she would get germs and pass them on to her children in a way that it would end up causing serious illness or even death to her children. And so this client spent hours and hours cleaning in order to avoid those germs or get rid of those germs. So for example, after she went grocery shopping, she would come home and take every single item that she just purchased from the grocery store and stand at the sink and wash it. Even if it was a bag of brown sugar or a bag of beans or a can of peaches or whatever the item was, she had to wash and scrub that item to get all the germs off. When she needed to change, so in that situation, she spent hours at the sink after the grocery shopping trip just to put the groceries away. When she needed to change one of her children's diapers, again, it was an hour-long ordeal, or 2 hours, 3 hours, depending on where the child had soiled the diaper. She had to, scrub the child, scrub herself. She had to, every time, give a complete bath to the child. She had to scrub the room that the child had soiled his diaper in. And so, instead of being a, maybe 1 minute task to change her child's diaper, it was an hour, 2, 3 hour long task that she had to complete. Although she was very intelligent and very capable, because she had to spend so much time trying to get rid of the germs, this individual could not hold a job. And she had to live with her parents so that they could take care of the finances and do the things that she couldn't do because she was spending so much time on the disorder. So this is what we're talking about for disability. You can see with this individual how there's violation of social norms as well. That's not behavior that we expect to see on a normal basis. The average individual doesn't do those things, so it violates the social norms. With social norms, we're also talking about social rules or socially acceptable behavior. And so another example of this would be a client that I worked with who had attempted to take his life several times because of his addiction to alcohol. Ever since he was young, he remembers as a teenager always having access and using alcohol heavily. And that became his coping mechanism with stressors in his life. Now, he had had various jobs, except when people found out about his level of drinking, he got fired from those jobs. He was dismissed from them. And that's because the drinking behavior was socially unacceptable. And it caused impairment in his life because of that. The last, like I mentioned, is dysfunction. We argue that maybe something has gone wrong in the individual. Something is off in the way they're thinking, in their behaviors, their biological, psychological, developmental processes. They're just not working properly. But I'd like to think a little bit more about that one. Focus on the dysfunction for a bit. In thinking about dysfunction, let's do a task. Let's see if you have any dysfunction, how you do on this task. So take out a piece of paper. And what we're going to do is I'm going to read a list of words to you. And I'm going to read 15 words. And I want you, after I read them off, I'm going to give you 60 seconds to try to write down as many of them as you can. And we'll do this twice with two different lists. You ready? First list: table, sit, legs, seat, couch, desk, recliner, sofa, wood, cushion, swivel, stool, sitting, rocking, and bench. Let's pause for just 10 seconds. And now, write down as many of those words as you can remember. Okay? Let's do the second list now. I'll read the list again, we'll pause for a second, and then I want you to write down as many of those words as you can remember. Water, stream, lake, Mississippi, boat, tide, swim, flow, run, barge, creek, brook, fish, bridge, and winding. Pause again for 10 seconds. And go ahead and write as many of those as you can remember. Okay, stop. All right. So I want you to look at your list now, and did you write down chair for the first list or river for the second list? You may have written both of them down, or you may not have. You may have done one, or maybe you didn't do any. But most people will have recalled chair and river. And that's interesting because I never said chair or river. So here's a dysfunction. Here's an example where your brain did not process the information correctly. Would we call this psychopathology? According to the dysfunction, an error in our processing, maybe we should, right? Or maybe we should question kind of this issue of dysfunction for psychopathology. Let's think about this a little more. If you have time, go ahead and copy this link, paste it into your web browser. Very interesting video. This is a video about an individual, I can't recall his name off the top of my head, but an individual who has autism, who, because of his disorder, can remember a city landscape perfectly and recreate it, draw it perfectly, only looking at that city one time. And he's done this on several occasions. He flies into a city, looks at the panoramic view of it, spends some time just looking at it, kind of making mental notes and so on, and then he'll go into a room with no windows and he'll recreate it exactly by memory. All because of that disorder that he has. It's a dysfunction. That autism, there is something wrong, with the way his brain is processing information. But that error has also led to a gift, a talent that he's able to do. So check out that video. You'll see his drawing of New York, and you'll see he has replicated it with the exact number of floors in every building and everything, all by memory. And thinking about this idea, there's a quote that I really like. And this is particularly about bipolar disorder. It says the diagnosis of bipolar disorder has been linked to giftedness of various sorts, and this raises a special problem in that it is likely that the condition has a genetic basis. Therefore, it seems possible that in the near future we will be able to detect and eliminate the gene predisposing to the disorder. This may mean, however, that as a society we lose the associated gifts. Now that's an interesting thought, tying back to that video that I mentioned, that the disorder actually provided a talent or gift. Here with bipolar disorder, or some of the other mood disorders, we can think about it in particular for some well-known individuals who have shared about their mental health problems and the gifts that they have shared with society because of those mental health problems. A number of, like we talked about in the last lecture, actors and actresses experience depression or bipolar disorder, and that disorder perhaps influences or provides them with the ability to be creative. Abraham Lincoln with depression and anxiety disorders, I wonder how much of his disorder perhaps motivated him to change the plight of individuals in America at his time of presidency. And would he have been as motivated if he had not experienced some of the depths of suffering himself? Even on this picture, the very last example, or to the far right of it, is a psychologist, Marsha Linehan. She was an individual who experienced borderline personality disorder when she was a child. She had been suicidal, had attempted suicide several times, and had been locked away in a state mental institution for a good period of time. And it was her disorder that led her to the motivation to develop new ways of understanding, new ways of thinking, and new ways of treating that exact same disorder. And the way we treat borderline personality disorder today is completely different from the way it was treated then, and it was all because of her and her experiences with the disorder. So as we think about our definition of psychological disorders, I hope you can understand, or I hope you can see that it's not one of these things alone. One of these things alone, each individual one is flawed. It has its limitations if we're trying to define or understand psychopathology. We need a combination. That's how we define psychopathology. That's how we define these psychological disorders, through a combination of these. So that leads us to our next question. Now that we understand a little bit more about what we're talking about with psychological disorders, let's think a little bit about why, or the causes of psychopathology. And again, this is a broad discussion of this topic. As we get into the individual disorders, we'll talk more specifically about, say, how depression develops or how panic disorder develops. Let's think broadly of why for all the disorders. As we do this, I want you to think about one of the most important decisions you've made so far in your life. Perhaps it was a decision to attend school, or a decision related to family. Think about one of your biggest decisions so far. Now, as you think about that decision, our first thought is, well, I chose that. That was from me. There's nothing that really led to that decision or caused that decision, but it came from me. But I want you to think closer. How much did your genes perhaps play a role in that decision? How much of your likes or dislikes or talents led to that decision that were passed on to you just by your parents through your genes? What about your environment? How much did your environment play a role? The situation that you grew up in, the situation that you were in at the time of that decision, that choice, could that have also played a role in your choice? Related, what about the teachings from your parents? Things that they taught you? Or your previous experiences with friends, with classmates, with family members, or even with strangers? How did that affect your decision? And then last, we have that piece for your own free will. Yes, that played a role, but hopefully you can see that any behavior is determined by multiple sources, multiple causes. And the same goes with psychopathology. Each of these play a role in determining whether or not somebody develops a psychological disorder. And what we call this is the biopsychosocial model of psychopathology. How we think about it is certain events, environmental influences and events, combined with a biological influence. And that leads to a predisposition for individuals. That predisposition, though, has to be followed by some type of stressor. Some type of, it could be an internal stressor or an external stressor, but something has to happen. And as a result, then, the individual experiences a psychological disorder. What we find is if we remove any one of these, the psychological disorder tends to not happen. So we really need all of the components. Let's start with the biological influences. If you take a look here, this is a table that illustrates the percentage or likelihood that an individual would develop schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, depending on their relationship with others who have schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. You can see that both disorders are relatively rare in the general population. About 1% of the population will develop schizophrenia at some point in their life. About 2.5% bipolar disorder at some point in your life. But if you take a look what happens if a second degree relative has the condition, there's more shared genes there. And so we see the percentage increasing. The likelihood of developing those disorders goes up. And then in the next bars, the group of bars, we see even higher. If a sibling, sorry about the typo in the table, but if a sibling or non-identical twin has the same condition, then the percentage really jumps up a lot. More shared genes again. And then even higher if one parent has the condition. Now we see half the genes are identical in that situation, so we'd expect it to be up again. But then if both parents have the condition, then the overlap of genes is very high, and the likelihood of developing the disorder skyrockets. And similarly, if an identical twin who has identical genes has the condition, the disorder likelihood is very high. But what you'll notice in this is it's not 100%. And so although genes play a role specifically with these two disorders, which genes play a higher role in these disorders compared to many others, they aren't everything. There's other things that are playing a role as well. Also, thinking about biological influences, we want to consider brain chemistry. We want to consider the influence of neurotransmitters. This is how medications for most psychological disorders work, through changing the way our body uses the neurotransmitters to communicate messages. With some disorders, we see that there are extra neurotransmitters with the system, With other disorders, we see a failure in the way the system uses that neurotransmitters. It's no longer using them effectively. And so perhaps neurotransmitters may also play a role in the way our brain uses those. There's also evidence for brain structure differences for some disorders. For example, up here you can see brain scans, brain images for a healthy individual and an individual who has schizophrenia. And you'll notice the differences. The healthy individual, of course, being the left brain in the two pictures there, and the individual with schizophrenia being the right brain. And you'll notice that the larger ventricles, the larger spaces within those brains when schizophrenia is present. Now with neurotransmitters and the brain structure, we really don't know the cause. We don't know the exact relationship. It may be that the disorder is a result of the abnormalities, or it may be that the abnormalities are a result of the disorder. And further research is being done all the time into that question. And with this additional research, I think we'll have more clarity, but it's likely that there may be some influence here. Let's talk now about environmental influences, the events that happen. You can think about that with anything in your life, any behavior, any interest, any like, that there is likely some influence from your environment. That might be your family, it might be your neighborhood, it might be your school, your peers, your culture, your religion. What you experience in your life is going to predispose you in some way. And generally, when there's an experience of negative things, an experience of abuse, an experience of trauma, we see the likelihood of an individual developing a disorder really skyrocket, playing a stronger role as a predisposer. And so based on the combination of both of those, like I mentioned, we have the predisposition. But then what? How do we determine, who develops the disorder or not? And that's where we see the distressor, the psychological component, playing a role. As we think about that psychological component, there's been several different theories that have been developed to explain how individuals respond to the distress and how individuals make sense of that distress in a way that either leads to a disorder or does not. On this slide, there are the kind of 5 prominent or main kind of theories that we'll talk about over the course of this semester. Let me just give you a brief review of each of them. First is behavioral. This theory suggests that whether or not somebody experiences a disorder is all about the response to their environment. Somehow their environment shapes them in a certain way that at some point in their life eventually causes problems. So with behavior theory, the individual may learn a certain set of behaviors that are very adaptive in the environment that they were in as a child or in one environment. But then as they get into a new environment, that same set of behaviors that were learned no longer fit. And it's when they no longer fit that the disorder then develops. Cognitive theory is similar, except here instead of thinking about the behaviors, we focus on the thoughts that the individual has. So based on the individual's experiences, they develop certain schemas or ways of thinking about the world. And they tend to start to see everything in those certain ways. Those patterns or ways of thinking about the world get reinforced over time until they become automatic. They can't help but think about the world in that way. The problem is some of those schemas and automatic thoughts aren't always accurate. And that's where psychological disorders come in. If the schemas or automatic thoughts are negative in nature or predicting the wrong thing, seeing the wrong thing in the world, then they can lead to a psychological disorder. Psychodynamic theory also focuses on development. Psychodynamic theory suggests that individuals go through stages of development, and there's an appropriate kind of way to go through those stages. However, psychodynamic theory focuses on the relationships that could disrupt those stages. It may be relationships with parents, early relationships with parents, maybe relationships with other family members, or even significant others, important people in the individual's life. But somehow a maladaptive relationship, a bad relationship experience causes the individual to get into a pattern where they get stuck, where they're no longer able to be adaptive to their environment, no longer able to be flexible to new relationships and new ways of interacting with people. And that getting stuck in that relationship pattern then causes the disorder for those individuals. With humanistic and existential theories, there's a big focus on the meaning and purpose in life. And with these theories, it suggests that everybody has a great potential. Everybody would strive and become their very best person that they could become if it weren't pressures from society, pressures from culture, pressures from others that limit an individual's ability to become their ideal. Those pressures may come from the media telling an individual they have to act in a certain way or they have to look a certain way. It may come from value statements from parents saying that there's an acceptable way to behave and an unacceptable way. And for some individuals, these outside pressures limit their ability to function to a point where they're no longer free to really interact well with their environment. And so we see psychological disorders develop in those situations. The last one I want to mention is emotion avoidance. Just like some individuals have fears of spiders or bees or whatever, some individuals develop fears of emotions. It's the inner experience that they have a fear of. And because they fear that inner experience so much, they're no longer free or open to their environment, to their world. They do things in their life to avoid the emotions that they fear so much. And that ends up causing psychological disorders. So a very brief kind of overview of each of the different theories about psychological disorders. Your book talks about these in more detail, and I would suggest if you're really interested kind of in this topic, Course in Personality covers this and a lot more, kind of the theories behind psychological disorders or psychological influences in an individual's life. We'll talk about each of these more as we get to the individual disorders. For example, with depression, how does behavioral theory view depression? How does psychodynamic theory view it? But for now, hopefully that's a broad overview to help you. And I think this is a good point to give you the code word for today's lecture. And so this is again the word that you would type into Moodle to get credit for the lecture. And the code word for this week is theory. So in Moodle, type in theory to get credit for the assignment. All right. So we have the biopsychosocial model. We have the environmental factors and the biological influences leading to a predisposition for an individual to develop the disorder. But that predisposition alone is not going to cause it. An individual may have a predisposition for alcoholism, but if they never drink alcohol, they won't develop an alcohol abuse disorder. An individual may have a predisposition for depression, but if things go smoothly in their life, if there's never the distressors, heavy distressors there, and they're given a lot of reinforcement, positive reinforcement from their environment, they may never experience depression. Sometimes that distressor can be very minor, but that all depends kind of on how large the biological and environmental influences are. Okay, well that's it for this week's lecture. Remember again, type in your code word to get credit for it, and read your textbooks chapter for this week, and then next time we'll talk about diagnosis and assessment.